"Do not serve her a meal, she isn't paying," Marcus Kane announced across the room, loud enough for every diner to hear, and for a heartbeat every fork froze in midair. Outside, rain pounded the windows of Whitfield's kitchen on the outskirts of Millbrook, Indiana, and the parking lot lights blurred into shaky yellow rings through the downpour. The air inside carried the scent of scorched coffee, hot grease, and old vinyl booths scrubbed one too many times. Tucked in a corner booth sat a woman wrapped in a worn gray coat, her hair still wet from the storm, fingers wrapped around an empty paper cup as though it still gave off warmth. For that evening she called herself Diane Cole, the name she'd given the waitress while asking for anything small and warm, swearing she'd pay once she was able. The waitress had scanned her shoes, then her coat, then the empty cup, muttering that this wasn't a homeless shelter. A man in a blue button-down chuckled quietly, another woman clutched her handbag tighter, and Diane dropped her gaze just as Daniel Boyd walked through the door carrying $7 and change, a small pharmacy bag tucked under his arm, and the heavy gait of a father who'd already spent his whole day pretending to be fine. Nothing about him suggested a hero. His coat was frayed at the sleeves, his boots still bore last winter's salt stains, and his face wore the quiet fatigue of back-to-back shifts, late bills, and bedtime stories told on an empty stomach. Waiting for him at home, in their cramped apartment above a closed-down hardware store, was his 8-year-old daughter Lily, likely coloring houses with yellow windows the way she always did when she wanted the world to feel less scary. He'd promised her supper, nothing fancy, tomato soup, a couple slices of bread, maybe butter if the cook was in a generous mood, meant to be their final meal before payday, stretched thin and split evenly, kept cheerful by a father skilled at smiling through hunger. He paid at the register with folded bills and coins warm from his pocket, and that's when he heard Marcus's command to have her removed. Diane rose slowly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment rather than fury. "I'm sorry," she murmured, "I only needed somewhere to sit for a minute." "Then sit outside," Marcus shot back, and 3 quick laughs followed, the man in blue, the waitress, and an eager assistant manager desperate to be noticed. Daniel stood there holding his tray, the soup shivering in its white bowl, steam rising off the bread resting on a paper napkin. He looked at Diane, then toward the door where sheets of rain swept across the sidewalk, took a breath, the kind a man takes when he knows doing right will cost him, and carried the tray to her table instead, setting it down gently. "Tonight she's a customer," he said calmly. Marcus looked him over with a cold smile and asked who exactly he thought he was. Daniel slid the spoon beside the bowl and replied simply that he was just a man sharing his dinner. "With whose money?" someone muttered, and both Daniel and Diane heard it along with everyone else, but Daniel only pulled the napkin free from under the bread, folded one slice with care, and slipped it into his jacket pocket for Lily. "Eat it while it's still warm," he told her, and Diane looked at him as though he'd handed her something far more valuable than a bowl of soup. Before continuing, tell us in the comments which city or country you're watching from, and if you believe in dignity and second chances, please like and subscribe. Stories like this one matter, and we're glad you're here. Now back to Daniel, because nobody in that diner realized the woman they just humiliated was actually Diane Whitfield, chief executive of the very company that owned every table, every sign, and every hidden secret in that building. Daniel had no idea he was talking to her, and that ignorance mattered more than anyone realized. Had he known her signature could move markets and end careers before breakfast, his small act of generosity might have seemed less pure. But all he knew was that a woman was cold, hungry, and being made to feel invisible, so he stood there empty-handed with his daughter's bread tucked against his chest while Marcus stared at him like poverty itself were contagious. "You think this makes you some kind of saint?" Marcus asked. Daniel waited before answering as rain tapped the glass and fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a pan clanging somewhere in the kitchen. "No," he finally said, "I think it keeps her warm for 10 minutes. A few heads dropped, not from being scolded loudly but from Daniel's refusal to scold at all. That had always been his way, carrying pain like a man hauling groceries up 3 flights, one step at a time, never checking who noticed. 10 years earlier Daniel had worked HVAC installation, earned a solid paycheck, and came home each night to a small house glowing with porch lights and laughter. Then his wife Sarah fell ill, the medical bills piled up, the house was lost, and Sarah passed away, leaving him with Lily, a box of old photographs, and a promise made beside a hospital bed: keep her safe, keep her gentle, and never let her believe love is measured in dollars. Ever since, each day had become a careful balancing act with survival. Rent came first, electricity second, medicine whenever Lily's asthma flared, and food stretched to look normal whenever there was enough. He worked nights unloading trucks at a distribution center off Route 40, then spent weekends fixing porch lights, loose cabinets, and old dryers for whatever $30 people could spare. Still, the apartment stayed drafty near the windows, and the fridge made a hollow echo when Lily opened it, as if even the shelves felt ashamed. What frightened Daniel most wasn't hunger itself. He'd learned to endure it quietly enough that Lily barely noticed, but the manila envelope waiting on his kitchen table from Family Services, warning that his custody arrangement would be reviewed unless he could prove steady income, safe housing, and reliable meals. Words like stable and consistent, he thought bitterly, built for people with savings accounts and spare cars, not for a father patching his daughter's coat with thread pulled from an old work shirt. Earlier that night Lily had stood by the window in her pajamas holding a crayon drawing of the two of them at a table piled with food, asking if payday meant they could finally get soup with the little noodles. Daniel had smiled through the ache and told her they could do even better, maybe bread too, and she beamed like he'd promised her a palace. That was why the diner stop mattered so much. It wasn't just soup, it was proof he could still provide. And yet, standing beneath those humming lights watching Diane lift the spoon with trembling hands, Daniel felt no regret, only a quiet ache mixed with strange peace, because a man with almost nothing still gets to choose: guard what little remains until it hardens inside him, or give a piece away and remember he's still human. Across the table, Diane took a small bite, her eyes welling with something she tried to hide, and Daniel looked away to spare her dignity. Marcus saw only a poor man wasting food on a poorer woman, but Diane noticed the folded napkin in Daniel's pocket, the careful way he'd saved half a slice for someone he loved, and for the first time all day, the powerful woman hidden beneath that old gray coat began to feel real shame. She dipped her spoon again, but her thoughts had already drifted back to that morning in the glass tower in Indianapolis, 42 floors above, streets full of people rushing with coffee cups and polished shoes, where hunger only existed as a line on a chart. At 8:15 that morning, Diane Whitfield had sat at the head of a gleaming conference table while Marcus Kane clicked through slides full of smiling families, hot meals, and buzzwords like community and compassion. The numbers looked flawless: food waste down, labor costs down, public approval up. Marcus stood beside the screen in his navy suit, voice smooth as polished leather, calling the regional system stronger than ever, lean, efficient, profitable. Then the slide changed to a photo of a young boy holding a soup bowl under the Whitfield's kitchen logo, and something inside Diane went cold. "What happened to the community meal program?" she asked. Marcus didn't flinch. "Reallocated," he said. "That wasn't my question," she pressed. "It was underused, expensive, hard to manage, people took advantage of it," he replied, 3 quick polished answers while 2 board members nodded and an assistant kept typing as if ethics could be reduced to bullet points. Diane studied the photo again, recognizing it wasn't even from one of their locations. She'd approved that campaign herself 7 years earlier, back when her father was alive and Whitfield Foods still believed a restaurant owed something beyond profit. Her father used to say food was never just food, it was welcome, it was dignity, it was mercy's first language. But since his passing, the company had outgrown her grief, and men like Marcus had mastered wrapping cold decisions in warm language. Then the envelope arrived, no return address, delivered by security straight to her private office, containing a printed complaint from a former warehouse employee, photos of sealed trays of edible food dumped behind a store, and a handwritten note reading, "They're using your name to turn away hungry people," with one final line, "Ask about Millbrook." She read it 3 times before asking her chief of staff who'd sent it. Nobody knew yet. "Does Marcus know?" she asked. "Not unless you tell him," came the reply. So she didn't. Instead she cancelled her afternoon schedule, took off the diamond watch her mother had given her, left her phone and driver behind, and bought a thrift store gray coat 3 blocks away, carrying 87 cents, a bus pass, and the alias Diane Cole, plain enough to vanish into. All day she walked into locations bearing her family's name. One cashier told her the restroom was for paying customers only, another manager asked her to leave before the lunch rush, and at a company-owned supermarket a security guard trailed her down the canned goods aisle until she stepped back out into the cold. Nobody yelled at first, that was what surprised her most. Cruelty didn't always arrive loudly, sometimes it came wrapped in a smile that never reached the eyes, in policy recited without mercy, in a door held open only long enough to push someone through it. By the time she reached Millbrook, her shoes were soaked through and her pride had worn thinner than her borrowed coat. She'd wanted the truth, and now it sat across from her in the shape of an exhausted man who'd given away the very meal meant for his own child. Daniel had no idea he'd become a witness to something larger. He didn't know every quiet insult in that diner was being etched into Diane's memory like sworn testimony. He simply stood near the table, steady despite his own hunger, while Marcus smiled at him as though kindness were a mistake needing correction. Marcus stepped closer, his polished shoes stopping just short of the puddle dripping from Diane's coat, telling Daniel he was making everyone uncomfortable. Daniel scanned the room, the lowered eyes, half-eaten plates, phones angled his way, and replied that hunger was what made people uncomfortable. He was simply putting a bowl in front of it. His words weren't loud, but they carried. Diane kept her hands wrapped around the spoon, afraid any sudden movement might shatter the fragile mercy of the moment. The soup was simple, tomato, a touch of black pepper, soft noodles settling at the bottom, but to her it tasted like something deeper than comfort. It tasted like being seen without having to earn it. Daniel stood near the booth, not sitting, not hovering, just close enough to keep Marcus from grabbing the tray again. "Do you do this often?" Diane asked quietly. "Give away my dinner?" He replied. "Only when someone needs it more," he said with a tired smile. "And do you need it?" she asked. He glanced toward the rain streaking the window, and for a moment the diner's noise faded into humming lights and a scraping chair leg. He could have lied easily. Men like him learned to lie kindly, claiming he'd already eaten, had food waiting, was perfectly fine, but something in her eyes asked for honesty without demanding it. "I have a little girl waiting for me," he admitted. "Her name is Lily." Diane lowered her spoon and told him to take the meal back, but he insisted she eat. No speech, no performance, just quiet dignity drawing a line. He touched the folded bread in his pocket, wrapped in the napkin he'd hidden before she could notice, though she'd noticed everything that night. The napkin bore a purple crayon heart in one corner and a backward letter L beside it. "Did she draw that?" Diane asked. Daniel looked surprised, then softened, explaining that every morning Lily marked things she wanted him to remember. "What did she want you to remember today?" Diane asked. He rubbed his thumb over the folded edge and said simply, "To come home." Diane's throat tightened. All day she'd been turned away by people trained to measure worth at a cash register, and now a man in salt-stained boots, likely facing a custody notice on his kitchen table, was guarding half a slice of bread like treasure. He had no idea his small kindness was unraveling years of Diane Whitfield's carefully built distance, that the woman in the gray coat had sat through million-dollar negotiations without flinching, yet could barely swallow now because a child's crayon heart had made her feel the true weight of every cold decision signed under her name. Marcus crossed his arms, calling it sentimental nonsense and warning Daniel one last time to leave. Daniel turned to face him fully and said he'd ask one last time that Marcus let her finish eating. The waitress froze by the coffee station, the assistant manager's smile vanished, even the man in blue lowered his phone, not because Daniel sounded threatening, he didn't. His voice stayed calm and almost gentle, but there are moments when calm becomes more powerful than anger, when respect stands so firm that disrespect exposes itself. Diane took another spoonful because Daniel had guarded not just her hunger but her dignity, then looked again at the napkin in his pocket, at the tiny purple heart meant for a child waiting at home, and understood this meal wasn't merely the last thing he had, it was the last thing he could afford to give, and somehow he'd given it without making her feel small. Marcus's smile thinned, irritation cutting through his polish for the first time that night as he studied Daniel more closely, recognizing him from somewhere harsher. "Boyd," he said slowly. "Daniel Boyd." The waitress glanced up, the assistant manager shifted uneasily, but Daniel didn't move. "You work the loading dock at the Route 40 distribution center," Marcus continued, loud enough to carry from booth to booth. "Night shift. I remember you now, you're the one who filed those ridiculous complaints, claiming edible food was being thrown away." "It wasn't a claim," Daniel answered quietly, "it was an accusation," Marcus corrected. "It was food," Daniel said, 3 plain, heavy words. The diner seemed to shrink as the storm pressed against the windows and the air thickened with the smell of soup, coffee, and something colder than rain. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal while still letting the room hear, telling Daniel that men like him loved a cause because it distracted from their own failures, that he couldn't fix his own life so he pointed at everyone else's. Daniel's hands relaxed at his sides. He didn't defend his poverty, didn't list his shifts or bills or the cold nights he endured so Lily could stay warm. A man with dignity doesn't always answer every insult, sometimes he lets it stand there naked and ashamed of itself. But Marcus wasn't finished, asking with a tilted head if this was how Daniel fed his daughter, giving away dinners to strangers so people could applaud him. The words landed hard. Diane looked up sharply. Daniel stared at the bowl, at the spoon in her hand, at the folded bread pressed against his chest with Lily's purple heart, and for one brief second pain crossed his face before he pulled it back into silence. "Leave my daughter out of this," he said. "Why?" Marcus replied, "isn't she part of the story? A struggling father, a sad little girl, a heroic bowl of soup, it's almost touching." A few people shifted uncomfortably, no longer entertained. The waitress stared at the floor, the assistant manager swallowed hard, even the man in blue lowered his phone as though the joke had curdled in his hand. Diane's fingers tightened around the spoon. She wanted to stand, reveal her real name, end it with a single sentence, but something held her back, not fear, but the need to witness how far cruelty would travel when it believed power was watching from its own side. Daniel spoke first, saying he didn't need anyone's pity, his voice low, clear, weary in a way that silenced the room, but she needed to eat. Marcus laughed shortly, calling him the noble poor man, then with a careless swipe of his hand knocked the tray aside. The bowl tipped, tomato soup spilling across the table, down onto the tile, over the toe of Daniel's worn boot. Nobody laughed this time. The sound was small, almost nothing, just ceramic scraping and liquid spreading and a spoon spinning once before stilling, yet it felt like the loudest thing in the room. Daniel looked at the mess, then at Diane, whose eyes had filled with anger and grief, then knelt, picked up the spoon, and set it gently back on the table, telling Marcus he shouldn't have done that. Marcus smirked and asked what he planned to do about it. Daniel pulled a stack of napkins from the dispenser and began wiping the floor himself, slowly and carefully, not because Marcus deserved it, not because the diner deserved it, but because Lily had once asked why people should clean messes they didn't make, and he'd told her it was because the world gets better when someone chooses to make it so. Diane watched him kneel beside the ruined meal, protecting everyone's dignity but his own, and in that quiet act she understood more clearly than any report could show her that Marcus Kane hadn't just spilled soup, he'd exposed the soul of the company she'd trusted him to run. Daniel finished wiping the floor in a silence that refused to forgive easily. The soup was gone, the bowl empty, the little purple heart in his pocket damp with rain, steam, and the room's shame. Diane rose slowly, still in her gray coat, still playing the part of a woman with nowhere to go, but something behind her eyes had shifted, no longer tired, now wide awake. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel nodded once, telling her to find somewhere dry for the night. Marcus laughed under his breath, calling it touching and telling them both to leave. Daniel looked at him not with anger but the worn patience of a man who knew pride only made bad nights worse, and told Diane he'd walk her to the bus stop. He pulled the folded bread from his pocket, checked it was still clean, held it briefly like a father holding his last promise, then left 2 quarters on the table, the only tip he could afford, and walked into the rain beside the woman he believed was poor. Behind them, Someone had already posted a video before the door swung shut, but it didn't show Daniel offering the meal, didn't show Marcus insulting his daughter, didn't show the soup being knocked over. It started with Daniel standing over the spilled bowl, Marcus's voice calm and professional, captioned, "Angry warehouse worker causes scene at Whitfield's kitchen." By morning it had spread across Millbrook, then Indianapolis, then further, with people who'd never known hunger deciding what it should look like, people who'd never faced a custody letter deciding what kind of father Daniel must be. At 6:10 that morning his supervisor called from the Route 40 warehouse, voice tired but not unkind, telling Daniel he had to suspend him pending review. Daniel sat at his kitchen table in the pale blue light before sunrise, still dressed from the night before, boots drying by the heater. "You saw the video." "HR saw it," the supervisor said. "There's more to it than that," Daniel replied. "I believe you," the supervisor admitted, "but belief isn't paperwork." Daniel closed his eyes. There it was again, the world reduced to forms and clips and signatures. Across the room Lily slept on the couch under a thin quilt because the bedroom window let in too much cold, her drawing from the night before resting beside the manila envelope from Family Services, a house, a long table, 3 bowls of soup, a purple heart above the door. At 8:32 the phone rang again, this time Mrs. Pierce from County Family Services, her voice careful and heavy with procedure, explaining they'd received information about an incident involving his workplace and would need updated proof of income and household stability given the ongoing review. Daniel looked at the empty fridge, the overdue electric bill, the bread wrapped in Lily's napkin, and asked how much time he had. "Not long," she said gently. Lily appeared in the hallway, small and barefoot, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Daddy," she said, spotting the envelope, children always notice what adults try to hide. "Are they going to take me away?" she asked, and the question shattered the room. Daniel crossed to her, knelt so their eyes met, wanting to promise never, wanting to build a wall around her with nothing but his voice, and instead simply wrapped his arms around her and held on while rainwater slid down the fire escape in slow silver drops, and somewhere far above the city, Diane Whitfield was about to watch the full video. She played the edited clip once, then again, then a third time with the sound muted, because lies often reveal themselves more clearly in silence. She was back on the 42nd floor before sunrise, still wearing the gray coat over her blouse, hair damp at the ends, shoes stained from the night storm. Her chief of staff, Sarah Lynn, stood by the conference table holding a tablet, worry etched on her face, warning that the clip was spreading fast and Marcus's office was already calling it a customer safety incident. Diane didn't look up, demanding every store camera angle, front counter, dining room, kitchen entrance, parking lot, audio if available. Sarah hesitated, warning that Marcus would ask why. "Let him," Diane said, and the room cooled around her. 3 hours later the truth arrived in separate files, each stamped with a time code, each colder than the last. Diane watched alone as the first video showed Diane Cole hunched in the corner booth, the waitress refusing her coffee, Marcus stepping in with his clean suit and cleaner cruelty, then Daniel entering with tired shoulders, pharmacy bag, coins counted at the register, paying for a meal with the careful math of a man who couldn't afford mistakes. She leaned closer as he set the tray down without flourish, without performance, just mercy placed on a table. The next angle revealed what the public clip had hidden, Marcus mocking Daniel's daughter, the tray knocked aside, soup spilling across tile and leather, Daniel kneeling not to protest but to clean a mess he hadn't made. Diane pressed a hand to her mouth. She'd witnessed corporate fraud before, watched men bury complaints and polish ugliness into strategy, but this felt different. This was the moment a company lost its soul over a bowl of soup. Then came the parking lot footage, Daniel walking Diane to the bus stop beneath a broken awning as rain fell in bright streaks under the streetlight, removing his own jacket to drape over her shoulders even while shivering himself, waiting until the bus arrived, stepping back to give her space and dignity without ever asking her name. Once she was gone he stood alone under the awning and pulled the folded napkin from his pocket, checking the damp bread carefully, hopefully, as though love could still make it home even after. Humiliation, the little purple heart visible for barely 2 seconds. Diane froze the frame there and stared until the image blurred. "Find him," she said. Sarah asked softly, "Daniel Boyd?" "Yes, for legal," Sarah offered. Diane shook her head, "For justice." By noon she had his personnel file, his complaint history, and the emergency scheduling request he'd filed with Family Services, which Marcus had marked denied, reason, low priority. She read those words twice, a widowed father struggling to feed his daughter labeled low priority by a company built on feeding families. Outside her office, executives gathered for damage control, but she didn't join them yet, instead replaying the final clip where Daniel left 2 quarters on the table after losing the only meal he'd bought, insulted, filmed, suspended, and still he tipped. That wasn't weakness, that was character rooted so deep that not even shame could uproot it. And in that quiet office high above the city, Diane Whitfield finally grasped the full measure of the man Marcus Kane had tried to diminish. By 3 that afternoon, the regional boardroom at Whitfield Foods filled with people who believed the meeting was about protecting the brand. Marcus sat near the front with a legal folder open, tie perfectly straight, expression calm in the rehearsed way guilty men practice in mirrors, surrounded by directors, PR officers, regional managers, and 2 attorneys who'd already drafted a statement calling Daniel's behavior unfortunate, disruptive, and inconsistent with company values. Diane entered last, no tailored suit, no diamond watch, no polished armor, just the same faded gray coat from the diner, cuffs still damp, hem stained from the storm. Conversation died instantly. Marcus half rose, saying they'd just been reviewing the incident. "Sit down," she told him. "We have a strategy," he said. "No," she replied, "you have a cover story." The room fell silent as she placed a small remote on the table and turned toward the screen, where the first image appeared, the public clip everyone had seen, Daniel standing near the spilled soup, Marcus looking composed, the caption accusing a warehouse worker of causing a scene. Marcus cleared his throat, insisting Daniel had created a disturbance. Diane clicked again, and a new video filled the screen showing Diane Cole alone in the corner booth, the waitress turning her away, Marcus's voice ordering that she not be fed because she wasn't a customer. A few faces shifted slightly, a lowered chin, a tightened mouth, quiet discomfort as people recognized truth before they were ready to name it. She clicked again, Daniel entering, counting his coins, paying for soup and bread, turning at the sound of humiliation, crossing the room, and setting down the only meal he'd purchased, his voice clear on the audio saying tonight she's a customer. Nobody in the boardroom moved. Marcus leaned forward, insisting the angle lacked context. "Then let's keep watching," Diane said. The next clip showed Marcus mocking Daniel's job, mentioning his daughter, calling his kindness sentimental nonsense, then the tray tipping, the soup spilling, and Daniel, instead of shouting, kneeling with napkins to clean the floor. The boardroom grew so quiet the air conditioning sounded like wind across an empty field. One attorney slowly closed his folder, a PR officer flipped her statement face down. Marcus's composure began cracking at the edges as he insisted Daniel had filed false complaints about their food disposal process. Diane clicked once more, and photographs appeared, sealed trays dumped behind a store, bags of edible bread marked for waste, internal emails bearing Marcus's approval, then a scanned copy of Daniel's complaint filed 6 weeks earlier, respectful, detailed, ignored. Her voice stayed calm as she said Daniel Boyd had told the truth before any of them were brave enough to listen. Marcus stood fully, insisting the company couldn't be run on emotion. Diane turned from the screen to face him, and the gray coat suddenly looked less like a disguise and more like evidence. "This company sells food," she said. "If hunger doesn't move us, we have no business being in this business." Nobody applauded, that would have been too easy. Instead something heavier settled over the room, the kind of silence that arrives when power finally drops its costume. She placed a printed document on the table, "Marcus Kane, effective immediately, your employment is terminated, your authority over regional operations revoked, and legal will review every complaint dismissed under your watch." Marcus opened his mouth, but for once the man who always had something to say found nothing. Diane faced the room again, announcing the advertising campaign was cancelled and its budget redirected toward a permanent community meal program at every Whitfield's Kitchen location, not for publicity, not for photo ops, but for people. Her voice softened as she added that Daniel Boyd would receive a public apology before sunset. On the screen behind her, the paused frame showed his hand holding the folded napkin with Lily's purple heart, and the wealthiest room in the building stared at it in silence, no one daring to call him poor again. The public apology reached Daniel's phone at 4:47, though he didn't notice right away, sitting on the edge of Lily's bed helping her tape plastic over the drafty window, pretending it was a project rather than a problem. The apartment smelled faintly of toast, laundry soap, and the tomato soup he'd never managed to bring home. Lily had stayed quiet all day, the kind of silence children use when trying not to worry a worried parent further. Then came a knock, soft, unofficial, just 3 gentle taps on the old wooden door. Daniel rose slowly, bracing for Mrs. Pierce or a landlord's notice or one more form demanding proof he was enough, but when he opened the door, Diane Whitfield stood there, no gray coat, no disguise, no cameras, just a woman holding a covered box of hot food and shame in her eyes. He stared at her, recognition dawning slowly then all at once. "Diane," he said. She corrected him gently, "Diane Whitfield." Behind him, Lily peeked around the kitchen doorway, and Diane smiled at the child with such tenderness that Daniel's guarded expression softened. "I owe you both the truth," she said. He didn't invite her in right away. A man humiliated by the world learns caution when it returns bearing gifts. "Is this pity?" he asked. Her eyes filled but her voice held steady. "No, this is justice arriving late." She handed him a folder containing a formal apology signed by Whitfield Foods, confirmation his suspension was lifted, back pay approved, his complaints reopened, and a new position offered, community meals coordinator for the entire region, with benefits, steady hours, and enough salary to stop family services from treating poverty as a character flaw. He read the first page, then the second, his hand stilling when he reached the part naming him to lead a permanent program feeding families in need. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "I know," she replied, "that's exactly why it matters." Lily stepped forward then, holding out half a cookie wrapped in a napkin, asking if Diane was the lady Daddy had given soup to. Diane knelt to meet her eyes and said, "Yes, sweetheart, I am." Lily studied her a moment, then offered the cookie, explaining they shared things in this house. That gesture broke Diane in a way no boardroom ever could. She accepted it with both hands as though it were sacred, while Daniel looked away, not to hide weakness, but to give her privacy inside her gratitude. 6 months later, every Whitfield's Kitchen across Indiana featured a small table near the front window with a simple sign, "Reserved for anyone hungry, no purchase necessary, no explanation required." At the Millbrook location, beside that sign, hung a framed paper napkin bearing a purple crayon heart and a backward letter L. Daniel never cared for speeches, so he never gave one. He simply showed up each morning, checked the kitchen inventory, greeted the staff by name, and made sure no child, no parent, no exhausted stranger in a wet coat was ever made to feel less human because of hunger. Marcus Kane's name vanished from the company directory, but Daniel Boyd's quiet dignity reshaped how the company measured success, not only in profit or growth, but in warm bowls served, doors kept open, and people allowed to sit down before having to prove they belonged. And Diane Whitfield, who once disguised herself to uncover the truth, found something greater than truth that night, a man who had almost nothing yet still gave, his heart still convinced the world could be redeemed. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments what you would have done had you witnessed Daniel give away his last meal, and share whether you believe one quiet act of kindness can still change an entire room. Thank you for watching until the very end.